Welcome to the Tapestry Podcast. We are your hosts, Pastor Aaron Kim and Stacy Na Aguilar.
So this is actually our last episode of this season. It's been really a sweet journey, I think, just speaking from Stacy and I, just to be able to walk with our church community, some of the guests we've had throughout this season, and exploring just the different topics as it relates to our series that we've been diving into, Whole and Reconciled. And on this episode today, we'll be exploring wholeness and reconciliation through what it means to be a wounded healer.
So we are super excited to introduce today's guest. Alejandro Cisneros is our guest today.
Yeah.
Woo! So he was our Tap Kids director for how many years?
6 years.
6 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And he's now our local missions pastoral resident and staff liaison for welcoming. That's why he's always welcoming you. It's not because he's a nice guy. It's because he's a staff liaison.
It's that too. He's also nice.
And of course, he's our, anytime you see tamales at Tapestry, it's because of Alejandro. And our resident churros and tacos contact. And we have to include here, Sung and Jinbei's babe. All right. So Alejandro and Pastor Aaron, if you guys were not working at Tapestry right now, what would be your dream job? Please make sure it's appropriate for our listeners.
I think that was for me. I think my dream job would be a singer/performer.
Oh, like a Taylor Swift?
No, I'm not. I'm not a Swiftie fan or whatnot, but more like Jennifer Lopez, or you know, right? She's not a very good
J-Lo.
singer, but her shows are great.
Performance, yeah.
She really throws it down for sure.
All right, I like that.
Nice.
How about you, Perrin?
I think it would be, I'm a huge Dodger fan, and I don't have the baseball talent, but if this is a dream scenario, I think it would be just playing on the Dodgers. That's like a childhood
Ooh.
dream.
Okay, what position would you play?
Specifically shortstop.
Wow.
I want to anchor that defense, you know what I'm saying?
I don't, but that's great. Who's the current shortstop?
Gavin Lux.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I did know that.
He's a young guy.
I would be, which I'm kind of doing it right now through this podcast, I wanted to be like a talk show host.
Oh.
Yeah, like an Ellen, but she's mean, so maybe not Ellen, but
An Oprah?
an Oprah.
She's also
She's
mean,
also mean. Okay.
Yeah.
but she gives things away for free.
Oh, I would love that. You have this. You have that. Anyway, I would be the next
You're living your
Oprah.
dream,
I'm
Stacy.
living my dream, y'all. So we are going to talk about what it means to be a wounded healer. The sermon unpacked that a little bit, but just as a reminder, it starts with a deeper understanding of your own personal struggles, sin, and since we have received grace and empathy and compassionate support from God and from other people, that we, out of this overflow, give that love to others. We feel our own sadness, anger, anxiety, our own sin, our own inadequacy, and then from having experienced that, we can deeply empathize with other people and then help care for them. This is kind of really great way of kind of wrapping up this whole and reconciled sermon series. So as wounded healers, we aim to be like Christ. We talked about it in our past podcasts. We don't disdain or deny any of our emotional struggles that we feel, but we use that grace that we've received to show to others. I remember when I first started ministry, and somebody had shared with me, confessed a sin, and it was just like a really big heartache, and thinking, wow, I can't imagine anyone doing this, and I didn't know how to really counsel this person. So I went to Pastor Charles, and he said, you first start with knowing that everyone is capable of all sin, that you have no place to judge this person because you could do this too. We're all capable of it. And I think that is a great basis of understanding of being a wounded healer, of understanding our own capabilities and understanding that we have received grace from Jesus. So the 7 wounds that we have this is by Fred Hartley. They range, and you can Google it yourself, but they range from anything like emotional wounds, identity wounds, physical wounds, to relational wounds, right? And so this is why we have Alejandro today. He's going to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so before we invite Ale, our guest today, to just share a little bit of his own journey and process of becoming a wounded healer, I think it's important that we realize that Jesus himself was the wounded healer, the original wounded healer. God became flesh, right? John 1. And he experienced every form of human wounding so that he might save and heal us, that we have a high priest who can identify with every one of our weaknesses and temptation. So yeah, that's ultimately the objective of even our conversation as we kind of share stories and experiences. It's like we're looking to Jesus, who we have experienced this healing from, who himself was wounded so that he might heal us in our wounds and that we can heal and walk with others in their wounds. But Aleph, for you, as you think about your journey, how did you know that you were wounded? When did that realization come and that you needed healing?
I think when it comes to physical wounds, right, that was very early on. From like maybe 6 to 13, I was sexually abused by an uncle and later on his son. And that kind of lasted for like 7 years. So that in itself was a physical wound that I kind of got, right? But even in that, growing up, there were a lot of like emotional wounds from my parents, especially my dad, the way he would talk to me. And I guess if people don't know, I identify as gay. So as a little kid, I had a lot of mannerisms, right, that I didn't know, I guess were quote unquote wrong or gay, but my dad would deem bad, and I'd get like, he'd hit me if my hands were a certain way, if I would talk in with a certain tone, like he would be like, don't talk like that, don't walk like that. But as a kid, you don't really recognize that, right? You're just a child, right? And even me going through like the abuse, it was something that I was like, okay, well, is it normal? I'm like, I don't know, because it doesn't click in your head, right? So I think looking back at it now, like those were like the physical wounds, even spiritual and heart and soul wounds that I didn't know that I had, right? But I think I started recognizing them in my early 20s, if I would say, right? Because despite the trauma, despite the wounds or the hurt, I still had a decent childhood where I would enjoy as much time as I could playing with myself, with my friends. But it wasn't until I was older that I started recognizing destructive patterns, right? From the cause of those wounds, right? It was because when you're a teen, you don't think about those things, right? People just assume like, oh, you're outspoken or you're very, chaotic. You have, all these things. But in reality, I was never really like that. It was just something that I didn't know whether I was coping, grieving, right? I think I realized that a lot of the wounds that I went through, I never actually got the process to grieve, right? Like I never grieved my childhood taken away, my innocence taken away, right? And so I was coping in different ways. Like I entered into a very destructive pattern of drinking alcohol, engaging in sexual, sin or whatnot. And it was patterns that I started recognizing. I'm like, this wasn't me, but somewhere down the line, this led me to do these things, right? Drink every other day, meet people and hook up, have an anger management problem, my self-worth being triggered, my identity, all of those things. So I think it was, I'd say, my early 20s, actually.
What do you think was like your turning point to being like, okay, I need help?
See, the thing is, I don't think at that point, and they say that in your 20s, you don't really know much. You don't pay attention to a lot of those things, right? So I didn't know I needed help, if I'm being completely honest, right? I thought I was normal. I thought it was a normal thing. Obviously, coming out to my parents was really hard. So having that weight of your shoulder, and at least, because I'll preface by saying, like, no one ever wakes up saying, I want to be gay or I want to be a lesbian. I want to do this, right? It's something that it happens. And with that comes a lot of bullying, a lot of self-condemnation, a lot of, guilt of your own, right? That it's a struggle that you carried on your own. So I just thought that my behaviors were normal, right? But I realized that they were destructive and maybe when I was like 23 and I'm like, something's not right. I was drinking every day. I was sleeping around with people every day for years, and to the point where, I ended up getting arrested, for, I got a DUI when I was like 21. And when I was 23, I actually got arrested for being a male prostitute. And I think when I got arrested, right, I still remember the moment. I walked into the hotel, people were rushing in to like tackle me, and I ran as fast as I could. And here comes another person tackling me, and they're like, "Oh, you're under arrest." I thought I was gonna get killed and my organs were gonna get stolen and sold. Right? That was my first reaction. But no, it was so like, "Oh, I'm arrested." I'm like, "Shoot!" But I'd say that it was in that restroom at the hotel room where I'm like, my life, I definitely need help. Like something isn't, there's no way I'm 23 to arrest. I'm like, I am a disgrace to my family. And this was a result of me believing that I wasn't worth much. So I think that's when I'm like, I realized I needed help. I didn't know what kind of help or what help looked like.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, as I was listening to your story, Ale, I couldn't help but notice that for you, the behaviors, some of the destructive behaviors or things like you were able to recognize that they're more symptoms, outward symptoms of like a deeper hurt and wound. And for you, it came to a moment where you were noticing and you're paying attention, like, oh, something in me is deeply hurting and that needs help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, recognizing that, it was like, you're right, these were just symptoms of a bigger issue, right? Symptoms that would come as anger, right? Or like even brushing things out, like, oh, that'll be fine, or. And I think me recognizing that is what probably helped me to realize that something was wrong at a deeper core, right? And the problem that I'd say what ended up happening was that I was so stuck already in the hole. I had dug a hole for myself every time I'd do all these things that it felt even harder to try to get out. It felt harder to try to look for help. I just felt like I kept digging a deeper, deeper, deeper hole, that the only way I thought this would end would be death.
So how did you go from there? And what did the steps look like to coming out of that hole? Was it PC that like stuck his hand down and pulled you out of that deep hole? What did that look like?
Well, it wasn't necessarily Pastor Charles, but, he had a great impact in my salvation, right? Along with another pastor who prayed for me, Pastor Jane, who's no longer here. But I think before even getting to that process of healing, I had to be even broken even further, right? Like, I think after the arrest, one of the things that I was asked to do by the court was to get a full SCI, STD panel. And mind you, I had never gotten tested because I was actually afraid as a child to get tested, because I was afraid that if my uncle or cousin had something and I'd get diagnosed with something at 15, 16, my parents would find out. Then I'd have to be like, oh, well, they're touching me kind of thing, right? So there was a lot of fear in something that should have been normal and healthy to do. There was fear, and that fear just grew more. So when the judge was like, I need you to get, full screening, my entire past came crashing down, where I'm like, I don't want to. Because the voice of my dad is like, if you're gay, you're going to catch AIDS and you're going to die. It's only inevitable. Like those kinds of words that he said to me, and just the fear of people knowing that, I was gay, created a lot of guilt and shame that led me to just say the only way was death. And I was, that night, I remember, I think it was this Friday night, I was ready to commit suicide. As a 23 years old, I felt like I failed in life. My parents were broke. We had gotten evicted. We had no money. And here I was just, facing charges of solicitation and whatnot. And I was like, no, this is it. And I remember praying, though, saying, God, if you're real, make yourself clear to me or known to me. And I heard that voice saying, go to church. So there's a saying that beggars can't be choosers, right? And I was a beggar. And when I heard that voice, I was like, oh, well, I guess I need to go to church. And I remember that Pastor Charles was working at LAUSD as a magnet coordinator director at the time. But he actually left the field to become a full-time pastor. And I remember visiting Tapestry in 2014, November, when you guys first started at the first building.
Wait, I think for the audience, we need to let people know how you knew PC prior to that. So you were his?
Student teacher, yeah. I was a student teacher. I would just help around the office. So I met him when I was, maybe 15?
Which is when I met him too, 15.
Yeah. So that kind of led me to come to Christ. And there it was through prayer from this Pastor Jane, who I just experienced God, but it was my brokenness that led me to Christ.
Yeah.
And you remember hearing from Pastor Shireen, who was on staff at that time.
Yeah, so Pastor Shireen said, I remember the day you came, Pastor Charles had the entire staff pray for you. So I don't know if that was in November 2014 or it was after. I would hope it was 2014. If that's the case, then I guess I do blame Pastor Charles for coming to Christ. Right? Or thank him in that case. I'm just kidding. I thank Pastor Charles for, and it's why he's so dear to my heart.
Yeah, and that goes perfectly to our next question of thinking about Pastor Shireen in your own life, Pastor Charles, you're talking about Pastor Jane, just people at Tapestry. But how has God used your community around you to bring about healing?
I think there was this sense of welcoming from everyone.
Is that why you're at Welcoming Committee now?
Well, partially that is why, but I actually started serving at Welcoming for like the first time I came to TAP. That was my first ministry, which we need welcomers in case anyone wants to join. Please talk to me. But no, it was actually that welcoming environment that people just kind of offered. And they allowed me to kind of just share my struggles without any condemnation, without any judgment. They didn't look at me any differently. And I think that in itself was the Lord healing me because I had misconceptions of what Christians were like, right? The Christians were hypocritical, judgmental, and all of these things. And for me, I was very fortunate by the Lord that I am able and was able to identify the church as a place of healing and restoration rather than a place of hurt. So I owe my community a lot for my healing, right? I remember a couple of friends that they would just come and just walk with me, right? Without having the need to fix me, right? It was just their presence. And I think sometimes people don't recognize it. Or maybe they don't realize the importance of community. It's like sometimes you don't even need to say anything. You just have to be present, and that's more than enough. Yeah. And that in itself is helping a person, just heal because they're reminded I am not walking alone.
So did it start with you coming to church, and then you slowly, I assume, got into a cell group?
Yeah, so it was right away, honestly. I think I've always been one of these people, like, you're in it 100 or you're not in it at all, right? So I became a believer the following, after the prayer that Pastor Jane prayed, I felt, God's love and his presence so immensely that, it was the first time I ever felt loved. And that in itself was the most beautiful experience I could ever imagine and remember. But that made me realize, I need community. Let me come to church. I started coming to church. I started going to small group. 6 months later, I went to a short-term mission trip, and that's kind of how I met a lot of my friends. Actually, in fact, I met one of my best friends through cell, right? So.
And then here you are now on staff, leading local missions, the very thing that you got involved in that helped you find community. And I love that when you said yes, Ale, you brought it to the community. Your healing was not just for Ale, and yay, Ale is healed and he's so happy, but you have been part of people's healing. I think about how, Ale, your story, which you have been so vulnerable and raw and honest with us. Before you, I feel like, shared that story, a lot of people held this, whether it's sexual abuse or even their own confusion about their sexuality, where they stood. It was a secret, and they did not know that they could bring it to the community. And you kind of paved the way for many people. And so your individual response of the yes, you brought that to the collective. And I think what's so cool too is that, like, it's not like you said yes to Jesus and now all of, you're like, now you're straight and woo, Ale, it wasn't like that. Yeah. And it wasn't like, oh, now Ale, you never have to remember any of the pain that you endured. Or, it was like, no, that's not what it means to be healed. You became more like Christ through your suffering, through your pain, and through your wounds. And you still have that cross to bear. And that's something that you have chosen to join staff and I think a vow of celibacy. Am I correct? And teaching others and all of us, whether not only in our sexuality, but just in general, like that cross that we have is still for ours to bear. That when it is healing, it's not that God automatically takes away all of our pain, trauma, and sinful desires, right?
Yeah, I agree.
And so, how has God used you to heal others in our community?
Yeah, I mean, I think recognizing that, healing is a journey, that was one of the things, right? That I felt like the Lord just has reminded me, like, everyone has their own journey. And it's not, like you said, Stacy, you don't just because you accept Christ doesn't mean things are, back to normal or like pitch perfect, right? But it's just more like, oh, Alex, you need to recognize that there's a journey, there's a process to everyone's healing, right? And sometimes I think just being vulnerable, and being able to share, I identify as gay or I struggle with X, Y, and Z, right? Giving people space to share their brokenness, right? Because I'm a firm believer that in order for you to get healed, you need to acknowledge that something is wrong in your heart, right? But, how can that be so if there's no spaces available, right? So I think that's been a big thing. My vulnerability has helped me become a better listener. I'm very fortunate to know how to discern. The Lord has allowed me to discern when to actually listen to people and when to actually say something, right? Because I think I realized in myself that I was very quick to try to fix people's problems. And I'm like, just like I don't like people trying to fix my problems, I shouldn't do the same, right? So through my mistakes, I've learned, like, sometimes you just need to be in the process with them. You just need to be wiping their tears kind of thing, and allow them to just have the space where they can just be raw and let their healing journey begin kind of thing, right?
It sounds like what it boils down to for you is just offering yourself relationally to others, offering hospitality, offering spaces to bond and connect and to hold each other. And ultimately, to me, that sounds like, as I was hearing you share, that sounds like, in a nutshell, what Jesus did. Jesus coming to us, God coming to us in the flesh, God pursuing us, God inviting us to himself, God healing us through relationship with himself. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been a recipient of that from you, Ale, personally. Yeah, your extension of friendship. And I could see how that has been just an integral part of not only your ministry, but just your process of becoming like Jesus, the wounded healer.
Yeah. Also, if you guys have never had Ale over at your house, you're missing out because Ale is the life of the party.
He is.
He really is.
The life of the party.
I'm telling you, I always tell you and Diego to start Latino Club here at Tapestry.
I mean, there's too many. Well, we don't have too many Latinos, but I know where they're at. Y'all better be hearing this, listening to this. And I think that comes from, I think one thing that I've recognized is that I'd be doing a dishonor if I didn't share that kind of love or grace to people. I was really in a terrible place, right? Where before even considering myself a wounded healer, I hurt a lot of people. That if I could go back, I'd apologize, but they say hurt people, and I was one of those hurt people that, did a lot of damage to people and not realizing it or not even caring about it, right? But when I experienced God's love, and it was just this overwhelming love that's saying, I just want you for who you are. The first time ever I felt there's a man that wanted nothing in return. And he was deconstructing all these false identity, right? Like the reason why I would fall into like these sins, sexual sins, whatnot, it was because I felt that my identity was just that. That the only thing I can offer to people, I was a people pleaser, I was all this, I cared about what people said, and the only way I can get things was through my body. Because that was engraved as a child, right? People don't know the trauma. When you're a child and you go through all these trauma, like that haunts you. And in my 30s, my healing journey is still there, right? But I'd be doing a dishonor to the Lord if I don't show that grace to people, if I don't share the love of Christ to people, because I've experienced that myself.
And that explains why you're such good friends with Jinbei. Just kidding.
I'm not going to say.
No comment.
We are
Love
really
you,
good friends. If you are
just
listening, Jinbei, I doubt you are. But yes.
And I see that, the Lord is really calling you into a deeper reconciling work, not only just on behalf of you, but of his whole kingdom. I think about even your own family. So you've brought your family to church. I think about, as you were sharing about how your parents were broke and where you were in your 20s, and now seeing the way that you support your family, not only financially, but spiritually, emotionally. You are that rock in your family. I know that your mom was really sick recently and you had some realization. Can you share a little bit about what that was?
So, just for the record, my mom's been sick plenty of times, actually. It's why I dread the hospitals. But the most recent one was a couple years ago, and she got diagnosed with gastroparesis, which basically paralyzes your stomach, right? And it doesn't allow you to digest your food properly. And that was caused because of her diabetes. But that kind of led her to go to the hospital for 4 months. She was in and out of the hospital, which started with like a simple cough, kind of just ended in her like vomiting every day. Right. And she'd get hospitalized every week. Every week, you just like, I'd see her faint, or she'd faint in my arms, or she'd go unresponsive. I'd had to rush her to the hospital. She lost so much weight that, they couldn't put the IV like needle into her, hand because they couldn't just find her vein, right? So that in itself, for me was just a reminder that that kind of pain, I think, and I have to preface by saying like, I was already a firm believer at that time, right? I was on staff already, right? But at some point, maybe because I had this false mindset that I'm strong, I need to kind of take this on my own because all of my family depended on me. I was the one going to the hospital. I was the one getting the calls at 2 a.m. I wouldn't sleep. I'd sleep like 1-2 hours, a night because I specifically asked the doctor to call me every time they put something on her, whether they inject or give her medication, all of that. So that made me believe that I was in it alone, right? And that kind of created this burden where I forgot about my community. I didn't allow my community to help me on this journey with me, right? So, in actually, I'd say that actually kind of took me a step back, and I wounded myself as I realized it now, and sometimes I realized that I let my pride kind of hurt me, right? Because I wasn't allowing anyone in. And I'll say it was the most painful experience and traumatic to see your mother just lying there, thinking and planning with your family like she's gonna die. Where are we gonna bury her? Where are we gonna have all these things? And to believe, and I had this belief that I had to do it on my own, was really a very destructive, kind of mindset that I recognize now that, it was pride that I didn't let people in, and I apologize for my friends for not sharing, my family, and for me not opening up, knowing that the Lord gave me an amazing community to share these struggles with.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is that you're understanding that like part of healing is also asking others for help.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. Alan made a joke earlier when we started this podcast that if I cry, he's walking out. And I feel like we're all this close to doing that. I think Pastor Aaron, too, wanted to conclude with this understanding of why it is that God calls us to become whole as we conclude this whole sermon series of wholeness and reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such a rich and meaningful series, I think, for our community. And if you're listening, I would encourage our community just on two fronts. One, your own individual process of healing. As Ale, I think Ale, you were alluding to this a little earlier, like you're still in that journey and you will continue to be in that journey. And in some ways it is a lifelong journey. But at the same time, on the second front, there's something happening that as we go deeper into our journey of healing and restoration and becoming whole and reconciled within ourselves, that we begin to find that it's not just for ourselves. In fact, that would be a very incomplete or misleading notion of our healing journey or process. That it's just like, oh yeah, I'm like patched up together. But no, it's actually in our woundedness, we offer ourselves as conduits of healing for others. And Ale, I feel like your story just exemplifies that so well and so deeply. And just for our community, I mean, as we wrapped up this series, and just a charge as we kind of move forward from here, just because the series ended does not mean, okay, we're done with, our healing journey. No, this was just a season to pay attention to it, to listen to what God is inviting to individually and as a community, but just to really encourage us to keep at it. The Lord is walking with us, and to walk with one another, to offer yourselves to one another, even as Ale was sharing, to ask for help. That's like such a simple, but I think a profound, constant, lifelong invitation that we can extend, offering ourselves to others and asking for others to walk with us in our journey. And so, as we move forward from here, we really do believe that, our wounds they point to a greater story. That's not the end of our story. It points to a greater story of the kingdom, of what God is doing, of his restoration work in our lives and in those around us through our stories.
Yeah, I love that Ale is a literal walking testament. I mean, we all are, right? I think about how Jesus, when he comes back, he's resurrected, and he literally shows Thomas, here are my wounds. His wounds are still in his hands, his wounds of self-sacrifice. And I look at Ale, and you were our first intern at Tapestry, pastoral intern, and now he's at seminary. And are you exploring becoming a pastor?
So I am in that pastoral track.
Yes,
yeah.
you
So
are.
it's my second year of seminary. I have about a decade left.
You're on the 10-year track.
Yeah. So I'm very fortunate to even have been given the opportunity, right, to serve and to be able to help people, right? I mean, if you would have told me that in my 20s and 30s I'd be working for a church, I'd be like, heck no, there is no way. I'm very confident that I think I'd be dead. And I probably would have died at 24, 25. So to see this, like, there are moments where I am just in awe. Like, yeah, I'll be upset at Christ. I'm like, I have so many reasons to be upset, right? From my childhood upbringing, there is a lot of hurt that, I sometimes cry. But I can't help but be in awe with him.
Yeah.
Because he took something and made it something kind of thing, right?
Not just something, made Alejandro Cisneros.
You know, and like, which gave me just a heart for the city, for the people in general. And I think that is what I'm grateful for, right? I think, there was a part of me at one time that I felt that I needed to like minister to like the LGBTQ community. But after spending time with the Lord, he just reminded me that everyone is hurting, that anxiety, depression, sadness, those emotions are not mutually exclusive to a specific gender or category, but to anyone. Anyone who's single, married, have kids can be hurting.
Yeah.
Can be at the cusp of just, throwing everything away kind of thing. And those are the people that the Lord wants me and everyone to serve, right? And to share his love, So
Yeah, that you remind me that not only is God able to heal, but he is a God who longs to heal. He wants to heal us. And that we become whole and healed to spread the whole gospel to the whole world. And you are a picture of that. And so are you, Pastor Aaron. And so thank you all.
And so are you, Stacy.
Oh, thank you to our one listener who's listening. And we will see you guys on our next season.
Actually, I just kind of felt a tug. And I just wanted to just pray a psalm over us as we wrap up, this season as a church, this podcast season as well. But Psalm 23, it's, of course, a favorite for many people and for good reason. But I think this maybe captures the sentiment of the journey, the highs and lows, the pains and the victories, but that the Lord is with us in and throughout everything, and he is our shepherd. And that is the most defining thing, and he will lead us.
Amen.
So let me just pray this over us. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.